Good stuff. So good afternoon, welcome back to the main stage at Event Sustainability Live. We've had some brilliant content on this stage already today. Really excited about this panel, exploring industry standards in events. Before we just kick off, I would like to give another massive thank you to our stage and indeed the event sponsors, Evolution Dome, standing under this magnificent inflatable structure, which come in all shapes and sizes for all different types of events. Brilliant company to work with. They're actually set up just behind the stage here, so if you'd like to talk to them, do go and grab them after the panel. We encourage questions from you guys, so you can do that in a couple of ways. You can use Slido. Some of you might have the app, or you can just go to slido.com. You can scan that QR code. That will log you into this session, or you can use the code there to get into the session too. Just submit questions on your phone. They'll appear on here, and the panel will tackle them in good time. Really simple to use. If you prefer the old-fashioned way, there is a roaming mic as well, so stick your hand up and we'll get a mic to you, and you can ask questions like that as well if you prefer. But without further ado, delighted to hand you over to Chris Johnson, who will be moderating your panel today. Chris.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to What is Good When Talking Green. My name is Chris. I'm the chair of the Vision 2025 project, which is a collaborative forum of representatives from the outdoor events industry. We've come from and are rooted in the festival industry, effectively the environmental steering group for the outdoor events industry, with various trade bodies and interested parties. And we've been working together for around 10 years now to hold this conversation in the festival and outdoor events industry. Where are we on our sustainability journey and where are we going? Also have a couple of other hats. I'm the co-founder of Shambala Festival and work with Ecolibrium, which is a charity working in the music and outdoor festival industry to support organisations to manage travel more sustainability. But this panel is not about me. This is about exploring industry standards, and I'm really proud to have two extremely knowledgeable people to come and have this conversation with us. And I'll let you introduce yourselves, Alex and Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chris. My name is Alex Camacho, so I'm the Community and Stakeholder Engagement Manager at ISLA. So we're a non-profit industry body attempting to steer the corporate event sector's response to the climate crisis. I also work for A Greener Future as a festival sustainability assessor. So I kind of sit across the corporate and outdoor live spaces and have a bit of a perspective on both of those there.
Hi, my name is Andrew Lansley and I am Innovation Manager at Cheltenham Festivals. I have a few other jobs as well. I'm a senior academic at the University of Gloucestershire. My principal research is in events, sustainability and accessibility. I'm also the cultural coordinator for Cheltenham Borough Council, and nationally I work with a number of organisations to progress sustainable policy, and I love nothing more than going through process-based, evidence-focused policy recommendations. So very excited to be here to talk with you today.
Great. So the topic was very much chosen because the perennial question in the outdoor events industry, the question that we get time after time throughout these last 10 years is, well, what does best practice look like? What does good look like? And of course, there are some obvious measures that an organisation can take, and examples in the festival sector might be reducing travel, audience travel. It's discussed at length as one of the biggest contributors of our emissions. Recycling more, using reusable cups. So there are things that we know that we can do that will improve the environmental performance. But still, in a confusing world of different products and different standards, different ideas of what good looks like, how can we navigate this as an industry? And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with these guys today. And I think a place to start might be recognizing that from my perspective sometimes, and observing the industry, it feels a bit like the Wild West in terms of like, how do we do this together? You know, what are we aiming for? Perhaps what we've got to hold on to as a starting point is the global picture and 1.5 degrees. Alex, could you...
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think on a global, on a more macro level, we talk about 1.5 degrees, we talk about net zero. These are global science-based frameworks and targets, and they're also increasingly a way for us to structure and understand our approach to the climate crisis. So these are things that operate across the entire globe, across entire countries. Of course, then individual countries also filter that through and have their own net zero laws. The greenhouse gas protocol, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is probably the world's most comprehensive and widely used carbon accounting framework. The vast majority of carbon accounting software is based around that, developed by the World Resource Institute. And in the future, when hopefully we do have more mandatory reporting requirements, they are very likely to be based on the greenhouse gas protocol. We've also got the Sustainable Development Goals, which are more intersectional, looking at social and environmental issues. But you have to remember as well that those are goals. They're not a blueprint on how to achieve those goals necessarily. Did we want to mention ISO 2012-1 here as well? Yeah. So that, again, many of you are probably very familiar with ISO 2012-1, environmental sustainability management systems. So that can be applicable to anyone if you're an owner, an organizer, someone in the supply chain, and then it looks at the 3 pillars of sustainability again. And it's actually very useful in many ways. It can help you identify issues environmentally first and foremost, reducing carbon emissions and waste, issues of biodiversity, helping your planning, your communications, diversity and inclusion, even helping to save costs. But that's a double-edged sword. It actually costs a lot of money to implement these things. If you're an SME, that can be very problematic. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of expertise, a lot of collaboration and coordination to actually embed that into your business. So there are many different frameworks around there. You will probably all look at net zero, you will probably all look at the greenhouse gas protocol, but then, as you said, there are various other standards that you don't have to necessarily use. Some people find them very useful, some people find them very challenging.
So the impression I get for anyone that's less familiar with this topic is that actually from a global perspective, there's a degree of clarity. You know, we have 1.5 degrees, we have a consensus on the science, we have frameworks to measure and report our greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we find ourselves as an industry in the UK where there is much less to hold on to. So Andrew or Alex, what's the national picture in terms of what affects our relationship with what is good and standards for the environment, for the event sector in the UK?
Yeah, I think there's, I'll be diplomatic, a disconnect between the political and the scientific movement within this area. I think if you're running events in the UK, anything like we have at Cheltenham festivals, you have things like ISO 2012-1 and 1.5 and all these wonderful guiding frameworks, but that can only get you so far within your sustainability practice. At some point, you get to that kind of threshold where you're starting to engage with the thresholds and the frameworks of local authorities, local SAGs, trying to apply the best practice you can, but that's very difficult when you can't control your public transport infrastructure. That's very difficult when you cannot define the energy provision for your site. So at the moment, and that's what I mean by there's a disconnect, it seems that the industry is very good and very literate at what is required for sustainable practice, but we're actually inhibited in how we progress because policy and process hasn't been agreed centrally, and the kind of variance that you get around local authorities within the UK and the different declarations you've had with different kind of net zero policies and strategies means that we often work in a load of different environments. There's very little consistency. There's a lot of will to do well, but not necessarily a lot of support and funding.
So Alex, in terms of what we might hang our aspirations, policy and standards off in future in the industry, and not wanting to take this panel into the future now, but what's the context, the policy frameworks, what this country has said it's aiming for that might affect the events industry?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the UK, we were actually the first major economy to pass official net zero legislation. So that was in 2019. But DBEIS, they have failed repeatedly to show how any of their policies can actually match any of those targets. So there's a massive disconnect there. Huge part of the UK strategy relies on things like carbon capture and storage technology in the future, which hasn't been tested at a scale to prove that it can be as big a part of the solution as they actually want it to be. Local authorities, they have direct impact on 1/3 of carbon emissions in the UK, and at least some influence on around 80% of carbon emissions. That's massive. But they have no individual statutory targets around net zero. They're actually forced to compete for these short-term pots of cash. That takes up a lot of resources. It creates a lot of uncertainty. They can't plan and prioritize for the long term. They can't upskill or increase capacity. Despite that, in the face of all of that, 300 of them have declared their own climate emergencies, and they're already assessing risks. They're already trying to make their own plans. And even the government's own research shows that with a local climate approach versus a national, we could achieve net zero by 2050 for half the costs, and with 3 times financial benefits and wider benefits, including health, benefits to public health, which is often entirely omitted from the whole net zero conversation. So they can have a profound impact.
So it feels like we have got something to hold on to when and if we're building a vision around where we need to be. We've got 2050, we've got 2030, we've got net zero legislation. Is there anything beyond the narrow focus of carbon in a national context that we could also kind of lean into and consider as an industry?
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about biodiversity here, and it's something I was speaking about on the other stage very briefly. There are 9 planetary boundaries. Climate is just one of them. We can measure emissions. We can measure kilograms of waste and how they're processed and convert it into emissions. There's no universal metric for biodiversity. It's on the agenda. It's being discussed around the United Nations, all around the world. But it's really difficult to quantify biodiversity. Having said that, the EU just this week passed new legislation, nature restoration law, where they're pledging to restore 90% of degraded land and waterways by 2050, 60% by 2040, 30% by 2030. That 30 by 2030, that's a more commonly known global target, and I really hope that the UK can follow suit with that, and how events can interface with that and start integrating it into what we're talking about on top of just emissions and waste.
Yeah, I think going back to what you said as well about the UN SDGs, looking at the intersectionality of sustainability and how it impacts different groups and communities, I think that there's a much more nuanced piece of work to be done on the grounds that if it's not sustainable for everyone, then how is it by definition sustainable? And I think even though the SDGs provide some good guides and some good areas of practice to focus into, it's actually looking a bit further into frameworks like donor economics, which takes the SDGs a bit further and then looks at human activity within the context of a social foundation and an ecological ceiling. Because obviously impacts that might benefit people might damage planet and vice versa. So it's also a balancing act that we need to do with this. It's not just about filling the gap between what we're doing in terms of voluntary certification activities and policy that we need to do as must-haves. It's also about the way that we're going to go about that and where we're going to place our effort addressing each of those situations for each community.
That's great. And I'm putting my event organizer hat on, and I will keep asking this question through this panel. I'm still looking for the guardrails as a festival organizer, and I'm thinking about benchmarks. Are they useful? Do you think benchmarks can be useful?
Yes, I think very useful. The fact we're sat here talking about it now, whereas sector is leading its own kind of community-generated series of standards and frameworks based on sustainable practice, and you think about a greener festival, ISLA, all the different infrastructures that have sprung up within the music and events and outdoor events industry around it. We're actually looking towards a much more progressive approach, I think, towards the way that we're going to approach this. And the fact is that we don't have those guardrails coming down from some kind of centralized and kind of evidence-based position. So as a sector, we create this ourselves. It's the same with funding it, looking at Earth% and the way that we're trying to redirect funding within our own sectors in order to help progress these policies and process. I think it tells you a lot about where the energy is at the moment and certainly where the political will is.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, thinking about benchmarks, thinking about data specifically, from an AGF perspective, from working on sustainability, from the festival world, outdoor, you guys have been doing this for a long time. You know, we're going back 5, 10, 15 years worth of research, of collecting data. AGF, you know, Julie's Bicycle in the cultural space, Vision 2025, the Show Must Go On reports. It's been a bigger part of the agenda in the outdoor and festival space for a lot longer than the corporate world. Having said that, the corporate world is starting to catch up. We at ISLA can't take all the credit for that. You know, a big reason is that there are more resources in the corporate event space. There's more money flying around. But I also think that ISLA, in particular Trace, our carbon accounting platform, the data we've managed to gather from that, the temperature check report, trying to establish an industry baseline next year with data from 500 events. I think all of these things are really helping the corporate sector to really catch up with the outdoor event space.
I suppose the risk of stating the obvious, the thing about a benchmark from an event organizer's perspective, wherever you are in a very diverse events and outdoors and music industry, is does that benchmark relate to me? And what my hope, and I feel really inspired by the work that you're doing at ISLA, my hope is that across the different subsectors, that we can get enough data to really make specific benchmarks. But I'm also acknowledging that this is sometimes feels like quite a dynamic process. And if we are going to create benchmarks, we also need the context in which those benchmarks make sense. What are the assumptions that we're making? What are we measuring? How are we measuring it, and how are we reporting it? And I think maybe there's a conversation to have around kind of standardization of, if you like, a greenhouse gas protocol equivalent for our industry, so that every tool, every process, every benchmark is relatable. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the greenhouse gas protocol does not contain sector-specific guidance on how to apply it, and it applies a lot more readily to some sectors than others. We work in one of the most complex industries there is. I think a big part of it is education, first of all. I would say now the majority of ISLA members have at least a working knowledge of what the greenhouse gas protocol is, what different scopes 1, 2, 3 mean for them. But it's an ongoing process. There's always new members joining who need that knowledge. There's always members, stakeholders outside of the membership that don't have the same knowledge. The other big thing is, for me, accountability and understanding, what am I accountable for? What sits inside and outside of that? Can 2 organizations be accountable for the same emissions? I'd say yes. Is your client responsible for the emissions of their events? They can say some very lofty things about sustainability ambitions and achievements in their own product or their own supply chain, but there's nearly always a disconnect between that and what actually happens at their events, and it almost sits entirely outside of that accountability. And then, of course, the elephant in the room of audience travel, someone needs to be accountable for that, and if everyone at the moment is saying, well, it's systemic, I can't really address that, it's too difficult, then we've effectively all got our heads in the sand. So, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of audience travel at Cheltenham festivals, we take that as part of our carbon footprint and reporting, and actually that's where most of our efforts are going. We recorded for, I think, 220,000 customers this year, their travel, the distance they travelled, the type of travel they went in, because that's actually how we're going to be able to form or have an evidence-informed policy. It's very difficult for me to get the senior management team to agree to something unless there's a load of data and evidence behind it, and I'm sure a lot of people here are in the same position, especially if you're asking for funds to implement a new sustainable travel plan. I think it was interesting what you were saying about accountability as well, and I think it's one of those things where in our industry there is an entire spectrum of knowledge where people are more informed. You've either got someone in a small organisation with sustainability as part of that role, you might have someone with a dedicated job in a larger organisation for sustainability. But really what we've got out there is a series of guidance, and then which is quite anecdotal but quite useful to help make some small steps. Or we have quite involved, almost kind of academic ways of reporting, measuring and progressing our carbon strategies. And I think it's about the responsibility within the sector. It's the accountability of us who are working, I think, at the front of it to try and help the 90%. How do we actually take all of this knowledge and all this empiricism that's built over the last 10 years and then make that practical and impactful for the rest of the event organisers in the UK?
Absolutely, and I think a big part of that as well is transparency. You can use carbon accounting for corporate reporting, or you can use it for decision making. When we're talking about corporate reporting, up until now, really we've been talking about very large companies where there's a greater onus on them to report. So hopefully they need to be quite accurate with the data that's going into that report. Of course, they want those figures to be as low as possible. But when we're talking about the events industry, most organizations are SMEs. There isn't as much of an onus on them to report so far. So the data, the carbon accounting, really is being used for decision making, which is great. You're not measuring for the sake of measuring. You're measuring ultimately to inform your reduction strategy. But if you don't have to report, then maybe you don't need to be as accurate with the figures that you're using. And I think that's where we kind of are at the moment. And over the next 12 months, there's a big reluctancy for people to publish this data online. And I get it. The more you publish, the more open you are to scrutiny. The more scrutiny there is, the more you're open to accusations of greenwashing. We have members in our network who I believe will be ready to publish a Scope 1, 2, and 3 baseline next year. They've been gathering a lot of data. I would invite them to be brave and to be amongst the first to publish that data and try and inspire other organizations to do so. And if you're worried about what to say and how to say it, ISLA can help people with that. As long as you're caveating your methodology, which data was really accurate, which data was based more on estimates, why, what are the gaps, what can we do better? As long as you're doing that, then you're encouraging validity, you're encouraging transparency, and you're inspiring others.
So I'm interested to get the temperature in the room, because I guess first base with carbon accounting is an awareness of what scopes 1, 2, and 3 are. So just as a show of hands, if you understand the idea, the concept of scopes 1, 2, and 3, could you raise a hand? Okay, so you guys are fairly literate. That gives me some hope. And also, picking up on the conversation around the transparency, the measurement, the reporting, I'm very aware that there's what feels like a very useful conversation emerging in the festival industry, which is being led by Hope Solutions, which is asking that question. So bringing together stakeholders to say, okay, we have the greenhouse gas protocol internationally. How does that apply to our sector? Can we agree how we do this? And reflecting on this personally, I used 4 different tools last year, including Trace, a Green Festival, a Green Deal Festivals Monitor, and I can't remember what the 4th one was. Oh, the Julie's Bicycle CC tool. So I used everything for the festival that I'm involved in last year, and each one was a very valuable experience for different reasons. And what I want from a festival organiser's perspective is a thriving market of tools and organisations that can help us on this journey. And it's really good to see that, the organisations that are there are maturing and new options are coming up. But I did get very different results from each tool. Now, to a certain extent, I think that's good, because each tool, I might have chosen, if I only was using one tool, to use each for a specific reason, or because it fits my kind of event or the part of my industry best. But what struck me was that sense of we need to measure things in the same way, because otherwise we can't answer this question, what is good? Do you have any more thoughts on how we might get there as an industry? So there's a conversation happening around the greenhouse gas protocol. Do you think everyone is heading in the same direction? Do you think it can happen without the sort of hammer of legislation?
Yes. Yeah, I really do. We've got that collaboration in our industry already. And yes, the government isn't in a position just yet to formalize this regulation. What we can do in the interim is work together to standardize, to align in what those standards should be, what are our objectives, what's our approach to meet those objectives, and really try and set the template for more formal regulation in the future, so that when that day does come, we already have what works, what doesn't work, what's robust, what's fair for all of the different stakeholders. The work is done, and we collaborate by our very nature in this industry, I think more so than perhaps any other industry. Think of how many different people come together to deliver any one project. So yeah, Hope Solutions, we've been part of those conversations. We've had a few, we all know what we want to happen. We all want alignment, we all want standards. It's about keeping it at the top of the in-tray and keeping it on the agenda and keeping this conversation going. Because I think between us all, I do believe that we're capable of doing that.
No, I fully agree. And I think we've already started on that pathway. We're already doing that as a sector. For me, it's about adding to that as well and looking sideways. I report a lot into leisure, tourism, business style events as well. And again, what the music and outdoor events sector has done is kind of charged ahead with this kind of knowledge, and certainly with measurements and reporting. Sharing that knowledge, sharing that context and experience across different elements of the economy, I think could be a powerful movement to create a bit more momentum around a human or a person or a private generated series of these standards, of these thresholds and frameworks, rather than waiting for any kind of centralised steer from government.
Great. Alex, I'd like to ask you what you believe the role of voluntary certification is in the context of, in the absence of these guardrails, we have voluntary certification. So just an opportunity really to sort of advocate.
Yeah, for sure. And again, this is something I can talk about from an AGF and an ISLA perspective. So at A Greener Future, we assess individual festival events. So really looking at a festival and putting it under the microscope. And the organizers would need to fill out a self-assessment beforehand, what they think they're doing well in all of these different categories, 12 different categories. We help guide them through that process. We go on site, we speak to all of the people involved, we take pictures, we observe, and then we develop a set of recommendations for them to improve. At ISLA, one member alone in our network might produce hundreds of events in a year. So there's no way that we have the resources to be able to assess what ultimately is going to be thousands and thousands of events across our entire membership. So we have a different approach there. We have our progression pathway, which is an annual review included in your membership. And rather than looking at a specific event, we will look across your operations, deliveries, measurement and reporting, how you engage with other stakeholders, and we give you guidance on how to better understand your environmental impact, how to measure, report, reduce your impact, so that you can try and apply that across multiple events throughout the year. Hopefully, eventually, all events throughout the year, but one step at a time. Two very different systems, but ultimately it's the same goal. It's alignment. What are the standards that we're all trying to get everyone on board with? What are the objectives? How do we achieve those objectives? It's about flexibility as well, because not all organizations are the same. Festivals are of very different scales and types. We have suppliers of all different types, agencies, so it's also taking into account the resources and circumstances of all of these individuals. Having said that, you're always going to get organizations who distrust or don't see the value in these types of assessments or certifications. And certainly there are organizations who make great progress in sustainability without having gone through them. But from my experience, from what I've observed, I think those kind of voluntary assessments are incredibly helpful for aligning everyone.
And I guess what they have to offer particularly is an independent voice, a reflection, and when you've been talking about trust and accountability, that in the absence of legislation and more formal reporting into government, this is what we have in terms of a degree of independence. There's something else afoot in the festival industry which is very exciting, which relates to this conversation around how do we collaborate and move towards what good is. And I hope you've all noticed already that a new chapter of the Purple Guide is launching, Environmental Sustainability. I think it's chapter number 37. So the Purple Guide was invented to kind of create some consistency across the UK outdoor events industry around safety. Andrew, you spoke to it earlier. At the beginning of that process, people in the industry were talking about a lottery of standards, and the Purple Guide very much has helped collaboration between the events industry and government around what good looks like across all aspects of event organisation and safety. Probably everyone is aware of what the Purple Guide is. So yeah, a new chapter has launched or is launching and will be live to subscribers of the Purple Guide this week, I believe, which is really exciting. It's not a standard, but it is a step in the right direction, I think, in terms of best practice. I heard you mention the phrase, the 90%, which feels really important in the context of the Green Code. And I'll get onto that in the Purple Guide chapter, because we're really looking at the entry level. Our experience at Vision 2025 over the last 10 years is that the Pioneer Group has always been committed and is still committed and is doing amazing things to push the envelope. But actually, if we're going to kind of have any impact, we need the 90% with us. And so that best practice really has been written with accessibility in mind. You know, can a community event organizer read this sustainability guidance and think, okay, that relates to me? Do they even understand the terminology? So that best practice really is an exercise in kind of just establishing what could the minimum standard of what good looks like be for our industry. And there's a project which I'd like to invite you to talk about, Andrew, which is linked to that, called the Green Events Code of Practice. Yeah, over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, so the Green Events Code of Practice, which forms the foundation for the chapter as well, incorporates a lot of the standards into it. The Green Events Code of Practice kind of consolidates and presents a top line of community-generated, agreed actions, commitments that can be made in order to promote more sustainable event format, more sustainable event practice, and it does it, I think, in a very good way of context within policy, but also written in a very clear way, which helps people understand what it is they can do to progress sustainable practice within their events. Now, again, kind of talking about that 90%, it's kind of the events we don't know about and we don't see within our sector that can sometimes cause the greatest environmental impacts. So it's not necessarily about your big top-line festivals and kind of AIFs and kind of members and things like that. It's about, you know, the Froster Cricket Club and, you know, the 1,000 people that go to their beer festival over 3 days at the end of August. Where is their guide? Where is their practice? And I think that's what the Green Events Code of Practice actually offers, is that first step. And I think if we're talking about getting people into the carbon literate space, we're getting people towards measurements and frameworks as a proper way of understanding their environmental impacts, then the Green Events Code of Practice presents a really good way of onboarding yourself with some good knowledge, but also helping you understand specific impacts that you can make within your own events practice. So I'm all here for it.
Great. So I'm proud to announce that the Green Events Code will be piloted next year across 10 local authorities. And as Andrew was saying, it's an attempt to kind of write on a piece of A4 paper, more or less, what does good look like for our industry, at least what does the minimum best practice good looks like. Okay, we're kind of there in terms of the panel time. We've got 10 minutes left, and I'd like to leave some space for questions. But just very briefly, if I could ask you both to wrap up on, in the context of, can we get to a place where we all understand what good looks like, measure it, report it? What are your top picks on what needs to happen next, or hopes, or desires?
For me, I can only re-summarize on what I've said, and it's education, accountability, transparency, also interoperability. To your point about using multiple different systems, how do they all communicate with each other? If they're using different conversion factors, different IT systems, all of these kind of things. I think Trace is a big part of the solution. I don't expect you all to be using Trace tomorrow. What if you're already using something else? What if you're using something on top of that that gives you more granular detail about a certain type of emissions? So education covers all of those different things. I think that's the starting point, and I think from there is to keep having the conversation and not doubling up on work as well. Because what we're doing in the corporate space, what we're doing in the outdoor live space, yes, there are different challenges, but ultimately we don't want to waste the precious time we have on doing the same work when we can keep having these conversations together and collaborating.
Yep, I think one of the most exciting things is the pilot that's happening next year. So actually looking and working with 10 local authorities to try and establish consistency and continuity through the Green Events Code of Practice. I think that is going to produce a lot of data and a lot of information that really will impact upon the 90%. And I think adoption to systems like ISLA, more sign-ups to things like Greener Festival, those will be really good key indicators as to whether that process has been impactful. But I also think looking at event sustainability within the context of accessibility, within the context of kind of political expediency, that is the way to go. Working in partnership, local governments, policymakers, they don't like words like disruptive and that kind of language. We need to work in step to create a database and an evidence set that really shows that we can move forward as a sector, but bring people with us at the same time.
Great, thank you both. Okay, time for a few questions. The one that jumps out at me is reporting used by some event organisers to delay actual action? Well, quite possibly. But I guess if you flip that question on its head, how do we know whether we're making progress if we don't measure it? And I suppose the step towards reporting at least gives us some kind of visibility, and the hope in that would be that it's not just a kind of greenwash exercise, that there's actually a sense of, okay, there's some eyes on me now, internally and externally, we're starting to report. So, I mean, yep, sure, it's possible, but I would say that most organisations that have chosen to report are taking quite a positive step with regards to sort of stepping into visibility and transparency. But of course, you know, I guess we all know you can kind of do what you want with data sometimes. And I guess that speaks directly to the question of the panel in terms of, you know, how do we step towards, as an industry, that transparency and standard way of reporting so that we actually know what good looks like and that an event organizer is meeting a certain standard or expectations. Oh. There's a question here.
Hi, thanks very much. That's really interesting. I guess from a perspective as either organizers or third parties coming in, there's a lot of talk about carbon, and that's quite standardized. Even pollution, there's a lot of sort of industry standards there. But in terms of especially greenfield festivals and sort of temporary aspect, in terms of nature impacts and biodiversity, do you have any like standards or sort of metrics that you could recommend or suggest at the moment? Because there seems to be a bit of a lag there in terms of how everyone can assess the impact of temporary events. There seems temporary so low impact, but actually there is a lot there. So yeah, a bit more visibility or opinion on that.
As I said earlier, there's no standardized framework or metric that is being used internationally, and you can observe what has happened. You could count how many trees or observe how much fauna has returned to the site as a result of your regeneration, but we still don't have that metric. I would imagine that over the next few years, we will start to have that metric, but then it's still going to take a while for that to become adopted around the world. So I think until then, we're kind of doing our best on the biodiversity front.
And the only other thought here is that, you know, sometimes an event needs to do an impact assessment. You know, there have been some very notable moments in event history where a rare species has been identified, for instance. But that's not standard practice. It comes up very occasionally when there's a problem. And I don't know if the industry is very proactive in terms of trying to unearth those problems. So I think there's probably some resistance. There might be some good intention around biodiversity amongst festival organisers, but there's certainly a little bit of a concern there in terms of what you might find.
I think I'll just quickly add to that as well. It's part of our responsibility as the organizations who are trying to steer this to educate people. I can't tell you I'm sitting here right now and I know everything there is to know about biodiversity. I don't. So I have a responsibility to educate myself as well, because I can't educate our members if I don't know that. So it's that feedback loop again of education being the starting point for all of this before we start getting to the standards.
Okay, time for a couple more questions. From the board, multinational event sustainability leaders have outright said that legislation is needed for them to justify progress to their bosses. What could this target? I mean, my initial reaction to that is that, yes, I hear those people speaking from various positions within various companies, that the simplicity of legislation around this would just make it happen. You know, I guess we're all aware of the amount of time that's put into justifying, you know, whether it's through financial or social or brand public image lens action internally within a company. So I sort of I feel the pain of people in big organisations. And anything else from you guys?
Yeah. If you ever come up against that, one tactic I've found is just point them to the 3-year strategy they've almost definitely got written, which will almost definitely have sustainability targets in it, and present it as a risk profile. If you're not meeting and delivering your 3-year strategy, which I'm sure your board or whoever your governance group will be involved with, that is actually a good way to get the tail to wag the dog, I found. So it's just my bet on that.
Okay, another question. So for small outdoor event organisers, cost is the bottom line. How can we incentivise them to improve their processes and environmental impact whilst on a budget? Anyone like to take that?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the things I'm hoping the pilot next year is going to resolve. So I'm also the inventor of the dates tool, or the donut assessment tool for events, which basically you fill out a couple of questions and it will produce a growth agnostic feedback document for your event profile. So it'll tell you where it's meeting social responsibility, but it will also show you where you might be exceeding the ecological boundary of your event practice. Actually going through that toolkit and looking at that kind of system, it gives you very specific growth agnostic recommendations, as in it will show you where you can make the greatest impact with any addressed spend. Also, it does it through an evidence-based process, so kind of back to the point about the bosses, it'll give you the data to justify that process too. So there are some things coming onto the market with it, and I think there are different ways of approaching it, but yeah, incentivizing is very much the way. So.
I mean, the question that's alive in me around this is are small event managers who are tight on time and resources, are they going to be in a position to take significant steps forward with regards to sustainability in their organisation if it isn't required of them? And I think there's a role for government, perhaps obviously, there's a role for the sector, that when legislation does come, and I hope that it does, that the support is in place for organisers at every scale to understand and take action.
Yeah, I mean, from an ISLA perspective, we encourage organizations to, rather than going off in a million different directions in this sort of scattergun approach, being more strategic and look at what is more or less achievable, what kind of impact will that have high to low, and then really focusing on what's most achievable and what's going to have the biggest impact. By achievable, that could mean time, it could mean money. In the outdoor space, I would say, just look at the festivals that have been assessed by AGF. There are many, many small festivals there who've achieved many, many great things. That doesn't mean that all of those small festivals have got infinite resources. So again, it's being part of those change-making communities, whether it's ISLA or AGF or anyone else, and seeing what's worked so far on those smaller budgets, and then seeing what you can apply from that in your own context.
Great. We've run out of time. Thank you Andrew and Alex, for your wisdom and time. Thank you for coming and joining the conversation today. I hope it's been useful. Goodbye.
Thank you.